When Jake landed in Japan, he felt like he was stepping into a dream. He had always been fascinated by the country, the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, the quiet temples, the rich history. But what really brought him there was an English teaching job in a small town just outside, Kyoto. It was the kind of place where the streets emptied after dark, and the only sound at night was the rustling of the wind through the old wooden houses. His apartment was in an aging building on the outskirts of town, a traditional Japanese-style unit with sliding shoji doors and tatami flooring. The rent was unbelievably cheap, and when he asked why, the real estate agent hesitated before muttering something about bad luck. He chalked it up to superstition. Every culture had its ghost stories, after all. The first few nights were uneventful. He spent his time setting up his apartment, getting to know his students, and adjusting to life in a foreign country. But by the end of the first week, the nightmares began. At first, they were just flashes, dark hallways, the sound of something dripping, a shadow standing at the foot of his futon. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, but he always convinced himself it was just his mind adjusting to the stress of moving. But then, things started happening while he was awake. One evening, as he was brushing his teeth, he noticed something strange in the mirror. The reflection of the sliding door behind him was open, even though he had closed it before stepping into the bathroom. He turned around quickly. Nothing. Just the dimly lit room. But when he turned back to the mirror, the door in the reflection was still open. Then there were the noises. At night, just as he was about to drift off, he would hear the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards outside his room. It sounded as if someone was stepping carefully, testing the weight of each step. He told himself it was the neighbors, thin walls, old buildings. But deep down, he knew the sound was coming from inside his apartment. One night, he left his phone recording while he slept. In the morning, he played it back. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the occasional rustling of sheets. But then, at around 3 a.m., a soft, wet whisper cut through the silence. It wasn't in English, but he recognized a single word. Keishite. Return it. His stomach twisted. Return what? He didn't take anything. Determined to understand what was happening, he asked one of his students, Haru, about the building. Her face went pale. She told him that years ago, an old woman had lived there alone. She was known for collecting dolls, dozens of them, all lined up in her apartment. No one saw her much, and then one day she just disappeared. When the landlord finally entered her apartment, all they found was a single doll sitting in the middle of the empty room. Jake's mouth went dry. He hadn't seen any dolls when he moved in, except he had found something. In the back of the closet, behind some old books, there was a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate hand-painted doll in a silk kimono, its black eyes staring blankly ahead. He had barely thought about it since moving in. But now, as the whisper echoed in his mind, his entire body went cold. That night, he placed the doll on the floor in front of his futon. He pressed record on his phone again and forced himself to sleep. The dream that came was worse than any before. He was lying in bed, unable to move, as something crawled toward him from the shadows. A woman, her hair long and matted, her fingers bending at unnatural angles as she reached for him. Her mouth opened, but her lips didn't move. Instead, a whisper curled into his ears like smoke. Keishite. He woke up gasping for air. His phone was still recording. With shaking hands, he played it back. The first hour, silence. Then, the faint creak of floorboards. Then, the sound of something dragging across the tatami. And then, right before the recording ended, a voice. Right next to the microphone. Keishite. Jake didn't hesitate. As soon as the sun rose, he packed the doll back into the wooden box and took it to the nearest shrine. The priest there didn't ask questions. He simply took the box, nodded, and told him he was lucky he hadn't kept it any longer. That night, for the first time in weeks, Jake slept without nightmares. He never saw the doll again, but sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, he still hears a whisper in his dreams. Keishite.